in a way, I'm not going to miss the scramble that sometimes happens at 8:45 in the morning for these talks. But in a way, I think I am. Hero Tales has been a fun book to go through, and we don't have that much left. But thank you for joining me this morning for a little talk about Grant at the Vicksburg campaign as viewed through the eyes of our historical authors, Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge. Now, we've just done a few chapters in a row in which our authors took special care to have a tribute to Confederate valor in the 1860s. And both of our authors of American Hero Tales are late 19th century Republicans, and their loyalties and their sympathies as they look backwards are absolutely with the North. But they've spent some time on Confederate valor as well as lessons to be pulled from the fights that we've looked at so far. Today, they're going to pay tribute to a Union general who also later becomes a Republican president, and that is General Ulysses Grant. And they're not going to do that in the context of talking about Grant's whole life. They don't throw in anything extra about his politics after the war, or his troubles before the war, or even his heroic performance in the Mexican War. Just like Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans, they're going to specifically look at him here as a military commander at a single fight and see what can be drawn out of that as a good lesson for the young Americans they're reaching out to as they compose this book. And they do, as always, toss in a little poetry, for which I appreciate them very much. This time it is Oliver Wendell Holmes, and this time it's quite partisan. What flag is this you carry along the sea and shore? The same our grandsires lifted up, the same our fathers bore. In many a battle's tempest it shed the crimson rain. What God has woven in his loom, let no man rend in twain. To Canaan the Lord has led us forth, to plant upon the rebel towers the banners of the North. Oliver Wendell Holmes. Well, what we're going to look at today actually happens simultaneously with the previous chapter, which paid tribute to the great charge of Pickett at Gettysburg. And out in the Western theater of the war, the struggle is for control of the Mississippi River. By the way, we've already been there once, in a sense, with that Battle of New Orleans with Andrew Jackson earlier to control the mouth of the Mississippi. But now we're talking about Vicksburg, and it is a fortified city being held defensively against General Ulysses Grant. And give me a moment to get my slideshow in order here. This chapter is General Grant and the Vicksburg campaign. The complete possession of the Mississippi, they write, was absolutely essential to the national government because the control of that great river would cut the Confederacy in two and do more probably than anything else to make the overthrow of the rebellion both speedy and certain. The natural way to besiege and capture so strong a place, and let's look at the map here, you see Vicksburg in the distance here. It's actually, if you look at that oxbow in the Mississippi River, Vicksburg is right above it, and you see the bluffs all the way down the river controlling it with artillery. The natural way to besiege and capture so strong a place, defended and fortified as Vicksburg was, would have been, if the axioms of the art of war had been adhered to, by a system of gradual approaches. When you're dealing with a heavily fortified place, you get closer and closer indirectly and slowly. That is how a siege is done. And here we have our opponents there in this campaign. There's an earlier picture of General Grant still wearing his hardy hat. And General Pemberton of the Confederacy there on the right. And according to the textbooks, according to how military taught after centuries of experience how to take a big fortified town, what you did was move closer gradually. Again, from our book, a strong base should have been established at Memphis. And then the army and the fleet moved gradually forward, building storehouses and taking strong positions as they went. To do this, however, it would have been necessary to withdraw the army from the positions it then held, not far above Vicksburg. So an apparent retreat would have been needed to carry out this strategy. But such a movement at that time, they write, would not have been understood by the country and would have had a discouraging effect on the public mind, which it was most essential to avoid. Something we see on both sides of that terrible war was the Americans at home, south or north, expected victories, and they expected aggressive action by their generals to go defeat the other guy. They were not content with a slow strategy. There was public pressure, and public pressure made government pressure, and government pressure came downhill onto military commanders. Sometimes it forced something pretty stupid to happen, in my opinion, such as the attack by the Federal Army at Fredericksburg that caused such a disaster. But Roosevelt and Lodge here, looking at Grant, say something very positive instead. The big picture here, the elections of 1862 had gone against the government. In other words, what they're saying there, in these off-year elections, not presidential elections, but the elections of 1862, a lot of Democrats had won. A lot of Democrats won, and so they say it went against the government. And there was great discouragement throughout the North. Voluntary enlistments had fallen off, a draft had been ordered, and the Peace Party, again, that's the Democrats, were apparently gaining rapidly in strength. General Grant, looking at this grave political situation with the eye of a statesman, decided as a soldier that under no circumstances would he withdraw his army, but that whatever happened, he would press forward to a decisive victory. And those words are in quotations, they're Grant's own words, to press forward to a decisive victory. Now, all through Grant's career, that's going to be his style. Grant is a grappler. Once he gets a hand on you, it's not going to leave. He's going to stay in contact and push and push and push. And that's going to be an effective strategy for him at Vicksburg, although he knows that it's risky. And he knows he's kind of breaking the military rules. So what's called for here, the experts would generally say, is retreat, build a base of supplies, move gradually around until you can surround and take this city. But Grant is going to push boldly ahead. He therefore took another and widely different line and determined to cross the river from the western to the eastern bank below Vicksburg to the south. And the river fleets going on there, the actions of the river fleets are very important. And Grant's use of the ironclads is part of his big strategy. On April 26, Grant began to move his men over the river and landed them at Bruinsburg. When this was effected, he writes, I felt a degree of relief scarcely equaled since. Vicksburg was not yet taken, it is true, nor were its defenders demoralized by any of our previous movements. I was now in the enemy's country with a vast river and the stronghold of Vicksburg between me and my base of supplies. But I was on dry ground on the same side of the river with the enemy. And that gives you a hint to Grant's character. I can see why they picked that particular quote from his. Most soldiers would maybe not say, okay, I got to cross the river onto the enemy side. So I felt relieved. That's the opposite, I think, of what most soldiers would probably say. They would more likely say, okay, we crossed the river and gotten onto the enemy's side, so now I was nervous. But Grant feels confident when he's in contact with the enemy, when he's right in there amongst them. That's when he feels like he knows what they're doing, and from here on, he can proceed as a soldier. And he is praised by Roosevelt and Lodge here for the way that he moved in a way that was different from what tactical and strategic teachers would have recommended, that he knew, in other words, when it was time to break the rules. He was doing something that was unexpected to the enemy and was taking advantage of the greatest strengths of his own army. And we've seen this a couple of times in our American Revolution lessons, the idea of defeat in detail. That's when you might have a smaller force, and Grant does have a smaller force in the Vicksburg campaign compared to all the Confederates put together. But by taking on pieces of the enemy one at a time, you don't get overwhelmed by greater numbers. Instead, even though you've got, to make it simple, you've got 20 guys and he's got 100 guys, but you manage to fight each time against 10 or 15 enemy soldiers. So even though he has 10 times as many or 5 times as many men, in each fight, you have slightly more men. That is what's called defeat in detail. And it takes swift and bold movement and sort of mystifying the enemy, as Stonewall Jackson would have said. His plan, in brief, was to fight and defeat a superior enemy separately and in detail. Pressing forward quickly, met a detachment of the enemy at Port Gibson and defeated them, marched to Grand Gulf on the Mississippi, which he took, and found he would be obliged to wait a month in order to make it a base, that is. He therefore gave up the idea of making Grand Gulf a base, and Sherman, having now joined him with his corps, Grant struck at once into the interior. He took nothing with him except ammunition, and his army was in the lightest marching order. This enabled him to move with great rapidity. So, dropping everything but ammunition and weapons, and prioritizing the strike. This sounds like Patton in World War II. When Patton was talking about supply problems, Patton's great quote was, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas." The absolute essentials were all that he carried with him, pressing forward and winning one fight after another against the defenders. General Pemberton, who was a little bit passive in this whole campaign, depending on fortifications, but General Pemberton is pulled out to go after him. But Pemberton, it says here, instead of holding a straight line against Grant, turned at first to the south with the view of breaking the latter's line of communication. This was not a success, for as Grant says with grim humor, I had no line of communication to break. So we get a little more then in our essay here of evaluation of the tactics and strategy as both armies move around and maneuver. But the theme remains that Grant moves his army quickly and decisively and strikes again and again against smaller forces he can defeat instead of passively allowing the larger forces to outnumber and consume him. Another theme here is that Grant is ignoring the micromanaging from headquarters in Washington. And there's a wonderful little story here. He passed out of communication with Washington. He did not hear from them again until May 11th, just as his troops were engaging in the Battle of Black River Bridge. An officer appeared from Port Hudson. Grant replied that the order came too late. The bearer of the dispatch insisted that I ought to obey the order and was giving arguments to support the position when I heard a great cheering to the right of our line. And looking in that direction, saw Lawler in his shirt sleeves leading a charge on the enemy. I immediately mounted my horse and rode in the direction of the charge, and saw no more of the officer who had delivered the message, I think, not even to this day. So he just blew this guy off completely and kept going because he was in the fight. As soon as the national troops, that's the Union troops, as soon as the national troops reached Vicksburg, an assault was attempted, but the place was too strong, and the attack was repulsed with heavy loss. So in this case, there is a brief Confederate victory here at Vicksburg. Grant then settled down to a siege, and Lincoln and Halleck now sent him ample reinforcements. So now he's reached the superior position. He was unable to actually take Vicksburg straight out with the smaller force, but he had done everything to get into the perfect position, and now he can accept reinforcements, and the siege of Vicksburg would go on. I'm going to do something in the spirit of Roosevelt and quote a little extra poetry, which isn't in the book. The defenders inside Vicksburg, who were very humorous in some ways in their resignation to enduring the hardship of the long siege, hoping for relief, which never came. But in a parody song called A Life on the Vicksburg Bluff, they talked about all the different things that they ate, including the meat of all the mules that were in the city of Vicksburg. And they referred to their own commander, Pemberton. They said, "Old Grant is starving us out. Our grub is fast wasting away. Pem don't know what he's about, and he hasn't for many a day." So the feeling in the inside of that siege was that, yes, Grant had mystified, confused, and outmaneuvered their own commander, Pemberton. It is not necessary to give the details of the siege. Tighter and tighter, Grant drew his lines about the city, where every day the suffering became more intense. On July 4th, 1863, Vicksburg surrendered. The Mississippi was in control of the national forces from its source to its mouth, and the Confederacy was rent in twain. On the same day, Lee was beaten at Gettysburg, and these two great victories really crushed the rebellion, although much hard fighting remained to be done before the end was reached. Okay, so that's our account of what happened. Now, at the very end, the last phrase in the essay, there is no campaign in our history which better deserves study and admiration. Why? This is what we must determine to carry away the lessons that Roosevelt and Lodge wanted us to bring with us as good citizens. Study and admiration. Why? Well, again, and we saw this in the Pickett's Charge essay as well, the comparison, these historians assume that every child of the late 19th century, every child is going to be familiar with a little bit of the history of Napoleon, his big battles, his big victories, his amazing generalship, the amazing generalship of the opponents who finally defeated him. And so it means something strong when he says Grant's campaign against Vicksburg deserves to be compared with that of Napoleon that resulted in the fall of Ulm. It was the most brilliant campaign of the war, with an inferior force and abandoning his lines of communication, moving with a marvelous rapidity through a difficult country. Grant struck the superior forces of the enemy on the line from Jackson to Vicksburg. He crushed Johnston before Pemberton could get to him, and he flung Pemberton back into Vicksburg before Johnston could rally from the defeat that had been inflicted. With an inferior force, Grant was superior at every point of contest, and he won every fight. Actually, no, on the previous page it says an assault was attempted, but the place was too strong, and the attack was repulsed with heavy loss at Vicksburg. So it's not quite fair to say he won every fight. And yet, these things that have been chosen to be admired about Grant, let's look at them. Let's look at what we can pick out of this essay. Remember that phrase a minute ago? General Grant, looking at this grave political situation, the discouragement at home of the Northern people, decided as a soldier that under no circumstances would he withdraw his army. The soldier and the statesman acting together. Grant's very good at winning a battle. A soldier who's very good at winning a battle, but doesn't see the big strategic picture, would not have been as effective. So Roosevelt is suggesting part of genius in military operations is to be able to see the big picture strategy at the same time as you figure out how to win the next fight that's right in your face. Initiative, the initiative that Grant takes, that he moves rapidly, decisively. He does not hesitate, and he does not wait for instructions from somebody else. Instead, he is a person capable, after he sees the big picture and the picture in front of him, of acting and acting decisively. Defeat in detail. We've gone over that more than once, and I went into detail about defeat in detail today. But that's one of the things that Roosevelt wants us to carry away, is that specific strategy. It's not a character trait, but it is something character can help accomplish if you see the situation clearly. And something that's going to characterize Grant through his career is a rule that's especially important perhaps when you have the bigger force. This is what the British failed to do in the American Revolution. Time after time, George Washington got away, struck and got away, was defeated even, but got away in good order, and they lost contact with him and had to chase him down. And these elusive Confederate forces, General Lee is very good at mystifying the enemy. Well, Grant is going to be a guy who, once he makes contact, is going to stay in contact and keep the slugging match going until superior strength wins out. And one of our astute observers says not to forget to mention Morgan at Cowpens. which in our South Carolina history is an excellent example of that. Okay, so we have a few lessons to draw from Grant and the siege of Vicksburg, and their tactical, strategic, and leadership lessons passed on to us through Roosevelt and Lodge in their American Hero Tales. Thank you for spending a little time with me and this essay this morning. And our next chapter, our next topic on Thursday morning is going to be Robert Gould Shaw, the colonel who commanded the 54th Massachusetts Regiment and perished in a fight on Morris Island in Charleston. So drop by and contemplate him with me and Roosevelt and Lodge on Thursday morning. Thank you very much. And anybody have any questions before we punch out for the day? I do appreciate your attendance.
Why did Grant? Why did he start out with a smaller force? Because didn't the Union usually have a larger force?
Yeah, so many things are about logistics. And logistics is pretty much, how do I put it? Getting the people and the things you need to the right place at the right time in order to succeed. And there's an old saying, low-ranking officers are studying how to win fights. Generals are studying logistics. Well, yes, the Union has more men overall, but it is very easy for the Confederates at Vicksburg to gather armies because they're on their home territory. And so they can gather more men in the spot because they have the supplies to supply those men until the supply lines get cut off by the siege. So, yeah, the Union usually has more men. And when Grant's victory at Vicksburg is going to make people up north and President Lincoln up north look at Grant and say, here's a winner. We've got a lot of generals who have lost battles against General Lee, even though General Lee always has smaller numbers. The North's biggest armies are up there. Remember, this is the same day as Gettysburg. The largest Union army is busy fighting at Gettysburg. But to pick a new commander for the main Union army, the Army of the Potomac, they're going to look at this guy that won at Vicksburg. And in the later battles of the war, Grant will always have much larger numbers than his opponent.